On June 18, 1815, the fields of Waterloo ran red with the blood of the last great gamble of the Napoleonic era. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, watched as his imperial guard was shattered, his army routed by the combined forces of Wellington and Blucher. 4 days later, in Paris, he abdicated for the second time, but the true wound came not from Prussian bayonets or British cannon. It came from the men he had raised from obscurity to glory, his own marshals, who refused to follow him any longer. In the spring of 1814, as Allied armies closed on Paris, Napoleon gathered his remaining forces at Fontainebleau, determined to fight on. Yet his most trusted generals, men like Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, Auguste de Mar, Louis Nicolas Devout, and Nicolas Oudinot, confronted him in a tense council. They told him plainly that the army would no longer march, that France was exhausted after years of relentless war. Ney spoke for them all when he declared that the army would obey its generals, not the emperor. Pressured by this unprecedented revolt, Napoleon signed his first abdication on April 6, 1814, ending the War of the Sixth Coalition and sending him into exile on Elba. Many of these marshals then swore allegiance to the restored Bourbon king Louis XVIII. Marmont went further. His corps defected to the Allies on April 4, 18, hastening the fall of Paris and earning him eternal infamy. The French verb ragazor, meaning to betray, derived from his title, Duke of Ragusa. When Napoleon dramatically returned from Elba in March 1815, beginning the 100 Days, some marshals rallied back to him, Ney most famously, after initially promising Louis XVIII to bring the emperor back in an iron cage. Others, like Marmont and Louis-Alexandre Berthier, remained loyal to the Bourbons. Berthier, Napoleon's longtime chief of staff, followed Louis into exile rather than rejoined his old master. At Waterloo, only a handful of marshals stood with Napoleon, Ney, Grouchy Soult. The rest had abandoned him again. Defeated once more, Napoleon surrendered to the British on July 15, 1815, and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, arriving on October 15 aboard HMS Northumberland. With him went a small, loyal retinue. Grand Marshal Hengiber, General Chaus de Montalon, General Gaspard Gougod, and Count Emmanuel de los Queses, among others. Notably absent were the great marshals who had once formed the backbone of his Grande Armée. In the damp, wind-swept confines of Longwood House, as his health declined amid the isolation imposed by Governor Sir Hudson Lowe, Napoleon spent his days dictating memoirs and reflecting bitterly on his downfall. To los Queses, who recorded these conversations in what became the famous Memorial, Napoleon repeatedly lamented the disloyalty of his marshals. He spoke of how they had forced his abdications, how many had accepted titles and pensions from the Bourbons, how their defections had sealed his fate, in his dictated commentaries on the campaigns. He grew increasingly critical of figures like Ney and Grouchy for their actions at Waterloo, reshaping history through the lens of betrayal. The irony was profound. The man who had conquered Europe, who had made kings and princes of his generals, died alone on May 5, surrounded only by those few who had chosen exile with him. The marshals he had elevated survived in comfort under the restored monarchy, some, like even voting for Ney's execution in December 1815. Napoleon's final battle was not on a battlefield, but in memory. The legend he forged on St. Helena outlived the betrayals, turning abandonment into martyrdom, and ensuring that history would remember not the marshal's pragmatism, but the emperor's unbreakable will.